All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 12. And that means that we are almost done with the semester. So, congratulations on all the progress that you have made. I hope that you feel confident kind of going into this last section of material that we have. We really only have 3 weeks together left. And so, time flies when you're having fun, and we will continue to fly. This week we are going to be talking about human rights and international law, but specifically we're going to be talking about the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. So throughout the semester we've talked about different human rights violations and kind of state sovereignty and all of that, but we haven't really delved into the United Nations until now. So this week we are going to learn about the history of the United Nations, kind of about the League of Nations, which was a precursor to the United Nations, and then we're going to kind of talk about the purpose of the United Nations and kind of their focuses. And then we're going to transition and talk about the International Criminal Court and kind of how that is composed. So every class is going to have a virtual lecture, including my online or including my in-person class. So for those of you who are not accustomed to online classes, I will timestamp this video, and any information that you may have missed or that I may have went too fast over, you can go and re-listen to it. I have updated Folio with all of the information. You have this PowerPoint along with my notes from the PowerPoint as well, and any videos that are embedded into this PowerPoint will also be available on Folio. My recommendation is that you take notes as you would in class, along with this presentation. So this week is exclusively online for my in-person class. We will meet on Thursday, but we will have a special guest joining us on Thursday. So I'm going to go ahead and include all of the material. For my online students, you guys have your routine down. So continue to do what you are doing. You guys are doing amazing. So, all right, with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the United Nations wasn't always known as the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations was founded in 1945, with their first official session happening in 1946. Before the United Nations existed, it was known as the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was formed after Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech. And the next slide is a video kind of detailing that 14-point speech and the importance of that speech. I have that video in Folio as well, but I'm going to kind of summarize that speech for you a little bit. Essentially, Wilson's 14-point speech was his congressional address regarding World War I. And the whole purpose of that speech was to assure that the war was being fought for peace in Europe. As part of that speech, he wanted to call and make it a practice of transparency that all countries that have treaties with each other have those treaties be made public. He didn't want anything operating in the shadows. He wanted everyone to know who everyone's alliance partners were. And then he also expressly called for this notion of a League of Nations. Um, and essentially, the reasoning for calling for this would be nations would come together and form a partnership so that they could be proactive in settling disputes and kind of talk about how to peacefully settle disputes. So the League of Nations was born out of Wilson's 14-point speech. Although Woodrow Wilson was the ironclad kind of thought founder behind the League of Nations, it's important to note that the United States never officially joined the League. That would have required the Senate and the House of Representatives to sign on to joining. And although the president was a firm believer in this notion of a League of Nations, they were not. And as you've read through chapters 2 and 9 this week, the League of Nations was largely considered a failure. They did not live up to the hype or the thought behind their their purpose. So, out of the League of Nations, you see a more improved League of Nations formed, and that is what was known as the United Nations. So, so here's the video for the Wilson's 14 points. It's a really good summary for you to watch, and then the next video will be the video summary on the League of Nations. Make sure you watch both of these. You will see questions on quizzes and exams based off of these points. The 14. All right, so now that you've watched some of the historical aspects of the League of Nations and kind of Wilson's speech, let's talk about the United Nations. The first and foremost thing that I need you to realize is that the United Nations is not a world government, but it acts in the interest of the world. It's really a voluntary space that all the nations come together to try to solve the problems going on in the international territory. It's designed to enforce international law, maintain security, uphold human rights, and to promote economic and social progress for countries around the world. And when we talk about the United Nations, most people just think of the General Assembly, which we'll get to. But the General Assembly is only one part of the United Nations. In fact, there are 6 what are called principal organs of the United Nations. Think of principal organs as different sections that make up the United Nations as a whole. So you have the General Assembly, you have the Security Council, you have the Economic and Social Council, you have the International Court of Justice, the Trustee Council, and the Secretariat. And we're going to go into detail on each one of these different organs so that you have a better understanding of what each one does. So let's start with the General Assembly. And fun fact, this picture is actually a picture of the General Assembly meeting. It includes every recognized nation. It has 193 member states that range in size and population. They meet annually in New York to debate issues on diplomacy and security. And in fact, you can visit the United Nations if you ever go to New York. That's where it's housed and kind of ran out from. So the General Assembly typically meets and discusses issues such as like new membership, budgetary issues, and they are like the Senate or the House of Representatives, if you think of our government. That typically it flows in a similar manner. Although remember, the United Nations is not a world government organization. So membership and budget matters require a 2/3 vote. All other issues only require a majority of the nations present to agree to it. And it's very important to note that each nation only gets one vote, regardless of the size of the nation. So Zimbabwe gets one vote, and the United States gets one vote. It doesn't matter the size of the nation. They all get one vote to be cast. There are 7 key areas that the General Council typically takes up, and those are listed on your screen right now. So they typically take up peace, security, and disarmament, development and poverty eradication, environmental protection, protection of vulnerable populations, special needs of Africa, strengthening the United Nations impact worldwide, and human rights, democracy, and good governance practices. So those are the 7 key principal areas that the General Assembly will take up. Much of the work that is done by the General Assembly and by the United Nations is divided into a committee system. And so they will call them committees or they may call them commissions. But when we get UN bulletins or UN directives, those are typically created in one of the committees and then goes to the General Assembly to vote on. And if the General Assembly passes, then the resolution, we call those resolutions, those are typically enforced. All right, so our next principal organ that we're going to talk about is the Security Council. And I want you to realize that the Security Council is one of the most influential and most powerful arms of the United Nations. The purpose of the Security Council is to promote peace on a large scale through diplomacy and sanction. The Security Council determines when and where peacekeeping operations are deployed. And there's 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The United States is a member of the Security Council. So out of the 193 countries that are members of the General Assembly, only 5 are permanent members of the Security Council, with the United States being one of those members. Now, the Security Council has the power to veto resolutions that may come before them. And in fact, veto powers are highly controversial, and they typically will not allow vetoes on any type of atrocity crimes or calls to charge for atrocity crimes. However, it's very rare for a veto to be used. Now, as you will see on the slide, the United States has cast 3 vetoes since 2011, all of which refuse to condemn Israel. Anytime a condemnation of Israel comes up, the United States typically is the first country to call for vetoes. But that's a political kind of maneuver as you look at the reasoning behind. But know that the Security Council does have the veto powers available, but they're highly controversial and they don't typically veto war crimes or atrocity crimes. In addition to the permanent members, there are 10 other nations that sit on the Security Council. Those nations are elected, and there are rolling elections every 2 years, which means another state is, when a state is added, they're on there for 2 years. And after that 2 years, they have to rerun to be on the Security Council. Every region of the world is represented on the Security Council. And you will see a lot of the peacekeeping operations force or personnel kind of falling under the Security Council because the Security Council employs the peacekeepers to carry out the resolutions of the Council. In fact, the Security Council boasts approximately 100,000 peacekeeping troops worldwide to this day. And there's a video here that is linked in Folio, and I would like for you to watch it. It kind of tells you exactly what UN peacekeepers do on a daily basis and what their mission is. So make sure you check that out. All right, so let's move to another arm of the United Nations, and this time we're going to talk about the Economic and Social Council. This council works to improve standards of living and protect human rights across the globe. So we've talked about various human rights violations and kind of defined what human rights were throughout this semester. I have made mention of the Economic and Social Council. I think when we talked about the LGBTQ plus third committee vote, I defined what the Economic and Social Council was. But for the purposes of this presentation, this is the council that typically takes up your human rights issues, unless there's some type of security threat to various countries, then that would go through the Security Council. But the goal is to advance the three dimensions of sustainable development across the world. So the Economic and Security Council looks at economic issues, social issues, and environmental issues. And their work is mostly centered on helping develop countries. Um, they work with the World Health Organization and other global partners to advance underdeveloped countries. And so they typically spend most of their time working with underdeveloped countries to bring them up to being developed countries in terms of economic issues and social issues. The next arm that we're going to talk about is the International Court of Justice. So please do not get the International Court of Justice mixed up with the International Criminal Court. Those are two separate entities, but the International Criminal Court is an arm of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice was formed in 1945, and it's the judicial branch of the United Nations. It is the only principal organ that is not located in New York City. It settles legal disputes submitted to it by the state, and it gives advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by authorized United Nations organs or special agencies. The International Court of Justice only hears civil cases. This is the only court internationally that hears civil cases. That is the key difference between the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is comprised of 15 judges who are elected for terms of office of 9 years by the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. So the justices are fixed terms of 9 years, and they have to pass both the Security Council approval and the General Assembly approval of the United Nations before they are allowed to sit on the International Court of Justice. And remember that the International Court of Justice only hears civil cases. Any criminal matters, such as war crimes or any of the atrocity crimes that we have talked about, will go through the International Criminal Court, which is not necessarily a legal branch of the United Nations. The International Criminal Court is its own entity established by the Rome Statute. So we're going to talk, I'm going to highlight the Trustee Council. I will say you really don't need to know much about the Trusteeship Council because it is no longer a valid council. It's not operational today. It was created in the 40s to help developing territories in their efforts to become independent nations. And in fact, before the Trustee Council was suspended in 1994, it had helped 70 nations gain their own independence. So a lot of the work with the Trusteeship Council kind of faded into the Economic and Social Council. So the final arm or organ, as we call it, that we're going to discuss is the Secretariat. This is the administrative organ of the United Nations, and it's headed by the Secretary General. Now, the Secretariat are the group of individuals who carry out the daily work of the United Nations. They're the ones that compiles reports and communicates between the councils. There's tens of thousands of staff members across the globe that comprise the Secretariat. They're like your bureaucrats in government. They're like the lifelong workers of the organization that don't necessarily change. Without the Secretariat, the United Nations wouldn't really exist because they're the ones that keep the paperwork flowing, keep the resolutions typed up, all of that. All right, so now that we've looked at the principal organs, let's now kind of go over the main concerns for the United Nations. So you're going to see the four main concerns that the United Nations deal with. The first is security. They want to maintain the peace, and so they do that through peacekeeping missions and diplomacy efforts, kind of mitigating any issues that may arise through diplomacy instead of war. They focus on humanitarian assistance, so like if there are natural disasters or if there are refugees that need to move in. And then we also talked about child soldiers when we talked about modern slavery. They have focused on reforming child soldiers and kind of bringing them back into modern civilization, desensitizing them from their potential brainwashing, things like that. Then they have a focus on development. So you see that some of the key organs focus on development in various degrees. That's a main concern for the United Nations is to help underdeveloped countries develop into nation states. They focus on education, intellectual cooperation, infrastructure, things like that. And then finally, I have this as a separate focus, human rights. But if you really look at this, and as we've talked about throughout the semester, human rights is interwoven into the core mission of the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations was really formed in an effort to recognize human rights and solve human rights problems. So although it's a separate major concern, human rights is inherent in the mission and in the foundation of the United Nations. So we've seen over the past several weeks with human rights violations, kind of how the United Nations has stepped in on varying violations. And so it's important for them to maintain that focus of human rights, which is inherent in their daily work. Right, so let's look at these a little bit closer. We're going to start with security first. I do want you to watch this TED Talk. It's a thought-provoking talk on the future of peacekeeping, and it kind of calls into question: are we doing the right thing? And kind of gives you a glimpse into those philosophical questions that academics wrestle with in the study of human rights. But peacekeeping is one of the primary goals of the United Nations. Security forces and peacekeepers are tasked with carrying out this goal, and military and civilian personnel, as well as police, all help maintain security of the nations. So, watch this to kind of learn more about peacekeeping efforts. Earlier in the presentation, you also had a video around what is peacekeeping. Make sure you watch that and have a really kind of a good understanding of what peacekeeping is. So the next focus is humanitarian assistance. And sorry, I'm writing down timestamps for you. Remember that the Economic and Social Council has a humanitarian affairs segment that is essential to the United Nations Foundation. Uh, this council discusses the activities and issues around strengthening the coordination and effectiveness of the UN's humanitarian assistance. They assist nations in response to natural disasters like Haiti, conflict. I know you guys probably don't watch the news a lot, and in my in-person classes we have this conversation all the time about how I encourage you to kind of watch the news, watch various degrees of news, because if you focus on just one channel, you're only going to get one side of the news. Try to find unbiased news. So NPR or something like that would be really good. But there was a fiasco in Afghanistan a couple of years ago around burqas. And women's rights was at the core of that, and how women were viewed in that society. And so the United Nations Humanitarian Assistance kind of came in and helped alleviate some. It's still a very highly toxic environment. But they kind of step in and help navigate some of that. And then they also help in like famine issues. In 2021, they had a meeting that focused on COVID-19 and the impacts in struggling nations. Helped kind of bring about new technology to assist with interventions. And the Economic and Social Council tackles climate change under humanitarian assistance. All right. So development is the next topic, next focus for them. There are 8 goals that the United Nations has in the development realm. They're all listed here. Please make sure you read them. I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them yourselves. And then finally, I touched on human rights. Human rights are inherent in the entire mission of the United Nations. Like I said, this is the most broad of the major concerns of the United Nations. Human rights are intertwined in nearly everything that the United Nations does. And all of the major organs really focus on human rights and the responsibility the of the United Nations to uphold human rights. All right, so that was our overview of the United Nations and kind of learning more about them. We're going to turn our attention now to the International Criminal Court and kind of talk about the ICC. We have talked about the ICC extensively throughout this semester. We have not focused solely on like the composition of the International Criminal Court or anything like that. So we're going to take some time to do that now. International Criminal Court, or ICC, was officially formed in 2002 and is located in The Hague. It has a mandate to try individuals 18 years or older at the time that the crime was committed. So there is, just like in the United States, we have a legal age to be tried in criminal court. The international community has that same minimum age as well, with the International Criminal Court, and that is 18 years old. The International Criminal Court is tasked with holding offenders accountable for the most serious crimes against humanity and atrocity crimes. So really, the International Criminal Court focuses on atrocity crimes and crimes against humanity. They are intended to complement, not replace, national justice. So you see that they operate under the principle of complementarity. Complementarity basically states that the state, rather than the International Criminal Court, has the priority in the proceedings with cases within its jurisdiction. If the state chooses not to or cannot proceed with accountability, then the International Criminal Court can step in and hold them accountable. A very good example of this is something that we've covered in class. Putin and Russia during the invasion of Ukraine. You all watched the video that we talked about, and there was a pretty consensus notion that Putin had committed war crimes in his invasion of Ukraine. And so the International Criminal Court, under the principle of complementarity, wouldn't be the first person to step in. In fact, Russia, under this principle, Russia has the duty to step in and prosecute Putin for war crimes. However, we know that Russia is not going to do that because Putin runs Russia, and Putin has sought and made it a part of his agenda to disband the United Nations and the international community. And so he doesn't recognize the authority of the International Criminal Court. And so we got to the process where the ICC stepped in. International Prosecutor stepped in and said, we understand that Russia isn't going to pursue this. However, war crimes were committed, so we are going to pursue this because we have a duty as the International Criminal Court to hold him accountable. So that's when he was served in his international charges. So that's the example of complementarity, is basically the International Criminal Court doesn't step on nations' toes, and they give the nations first dibs at kind of prosecuting. But if the nations can't or won't, then the International Court will step in. The International Criminal Court is composed of 18 total judges. They're elected to fixed terms of 9 years, and they have certain criteria that they have to meet. Just like our U.S. Supreme Court, they have, this is the highest court in the international criminal community, so they have criteria that they have to meet. There are 4 main organs or departments of the International Criminal Court, and we're going to talk about each one of these. Note that every department of the International Criminal Court, along with the International Criminal Court itself, like the hearings, is all housed in The Hague. It is not housed in the United States. It is housed in international territory because it's an international court. So the first department of the International Criminal Court is known as the Presidency. And the Presidency is composed of 3 judges. They are the main 3 bosses of the court. There's a president and 2 vice presidents. The Presidency essentially manages court operations and organizes the work for the other judges. They also supervise the punishments that are being imposed on those found guilty, and they're essentially the faces of the court. So whenever people see the International Criminal Court, they're typically seeing the Presidency wing of the International Criminal Court. All right. So you have the Presidency, who are like the boss judges. And then you have the chambers, which the chamber is made up of all the other judges. So in the chambers, judges work in small groups. And there are 3 kinds. There's the pretrial, the trial, and an appellate side. So I know a lot of you are not criminal justice majors, so I don't think this will be redundant. But if you look at it in terms of like the United States court system, you have like regular county district courts, you have that are known as superior courts, then you have court of appeals, and then you typically have like higher end supreme courts. Think of it like this. So your pretrial and your trial chambers hear the cases. So pretrial will make sure that everything is in order for it to go to trial. Then the trial chamber actually hears the case, and those judges supervise the case. Each chamber has 3 judges that sit together, except the appeals chamber. The appeals chamber has 5 judges. Each of these chambers carry out different tasks, so they're responsible for different parts of the criminal proceeding. So again, for review, the chambers are broken down into 3 sections: pretrial, trial, and appeals. Pretrial and trial have 3 judges. Appeals has 5 judges. And each of these chambers focus on a different aspect of the court proceeding. All right, and we are on our final leg of the International Criminal Court. So the final organ of the International Criminal Court is known as the Registry. And the Registry is the largest organ of the court. It is the largest department of the court. And its focus is to carry out the administrative and operational support of the judiciary and the office of the prosecutor. So your registrar is your chief administrative officer. So that's the person who runs the registry. They assist defenses, victims, communications, security, like all of your court personnel is essentially known as the registry. So like your clerks, your bailiffs, things like that. They also have a field operations unit to the registry that assist in investigations for the prosecution. So they're like the investigators for district attorneys. Very similar. So those investigators are tasked with trying to compile evidence that the prosecutors can use during the trial. Also housed in The Hague and in the International Criminal Court is the Office of the Prosecutor. Now, this office is separate from the other organs that we just talked about. The purpose of the Office of the Prosecutor is to conduct investigations and prosecutions of crimes that fall under the jurisdiction of the court. So, the jurisdiction of the court is basically an atrocity crime. So genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, all of those fall into the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. They investigate crimes and prosecute them, essentially. That's what this office does. They can be brought in at the request of the state or at the request of the Security Council of the United Nations. So again, remember, the UN Security Council is one of the most powerful organs of the United Nations. It has the power to essentially bring in international prosecutors to start investigations. So here's the process of the International Criminal Court. It's a victim that It's a video that I want you guys to watch. Essentially, the International Criminal Court has no police or military forces. It relies on individual states to make arrests. So the court doesn't have its own officers. People who are detained under the control of the International Criminal Court are held at The Hague in their own detention center, but essentially, um, it, the International Criminal Court relies on varying states to help them bring people to justice. There are rights of the accused in the International Criminal Court. As you can see, I have listed all of these rights. These rights will, sorry, these rights will look very familiar to you because they're very similar to accused rights that our Bill of Rights lays out in our U.S. Constitution. So you'll see right to remain silent, right to prepare for a defense, right to counsel. One thing that is new in the International Criminal Court that you would not be familiar with is notice that the accused have rights to an interpreter. Remember, this is an international criminal court. There is no one universal language. So it is very strict and very focused that the accused has a right to hear the trial in their own language. So that is something you might see come up again. And finally, we've talked about this, but there's some differences between the Court of Justice, the UN Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court. Remember that the International Court of Justice hears cases involving states, not people. They hear the issues about borders, maritime zones, treaty violations. There's usually 15 judges, and it's typically civil matters. The International Criminal Court hears cases involving people, not states. Their jurisdiction is atrocity crimes. So, and there's 18 judges, and they're not. The International Criminal Court is separate from the United Nations. So those are some key differences that you're going to want to make sure you remember. All right, everybody, that is all for this week. I look forward to next week. Make sure you check out Folio, watch the videos. Online students, make sure you take your quiz and do your discussion post. In-person class, I will see you on Thursday, where we will actually have a special guest in class. So with that, I hope you all have a great week, and feel free to reach out if you need anything.